Werewolves is the newest monster horror flick to hit theaters. It's directed by Stephen Miller, and it stars Frank Grillo as a man who's trying to protect the people he loves during a supermoon werewolf apocalypse. And he's also a scientist working with a team to try and find a cure for this supermoon werewolf apocalypse. Now, what is this movie all about? What's going on with this thing? Well, at the beginning of the movie, you find out that 1 year previous to the start of this film, there was a supermoon event where when the supermoon came out and people were touched by the moonlight from that supermoon, they turned into mindless werewolves. It didn't matter if their mother was next to them. It didn't matter if their brother was next to them. They just turned into mindless werewolves that went after everybody. And so the whole globe was affected by this. And because the globe was affected by this, you now have the world sort of working together and try to find a cure for this werewolf apocalypse, because at the beginning of this movie you find out that there's a new supermoon coming through, and when it comes through they're afraid that it's going to start turning people back into werewolves, and that is of course exactly what it's going to do. And so now you've got this group of scientists that are trying to find a cure while you've got people in the regular world just trying to stay safe from this werewolf apocalypse. And that's the best setup that I can give you for Werewolves. If that sounds like a fun time at the theater, well, you should go out, buy some popcorn, and watch this movie on a big screen. And if this is the first time you're finding my channel, well, I would love for you to hit that subscribe button and check out all of the different content that I have on my channel. Whether you like movie reviews, horror movie reviews, Blu-ray talks, series reviews, or even movies ranked. We're coming up on the end of December here, which means I'm going to have a lot of top 10 lists. So if this is the first time you found me, hit that subscribe button and check out the rest of my channel, please. But with that said, let's get into my positives and some of my negatives for Werewolves. First positive I have for this movie is going to be the setup and premise for this film. Just the idea of a supermoon coming out and affecting everybody on Earth at the same time, turning everybody that gets touched by moonlight into these mindless werewolves. That's a pretty cool premise. That's a pretty cool setup, and I liked that about this movie. I thought the setup for this film was done really well. They brought you in. They didn't make you wait very long. They're like, hey, here's what's going on. You got people trying to protect themselves, and go. And what this movie really reminded me of was The Purge, not to the extent of crime is legal for one night. It's that crime can't be stopped for one night, because as the supermoon comes out, everybody is affected. And no, I'm not saying The Purge because Frank Grillo was in the second Purge movie, although that's a coincidence, but that's what this movie felt like. You had these scientists that were trying to come up with a cure, but you had the normal people around the globe trying to fortify their houses and make sure they were safe, stay out of the moonlight, because they didn't want to turn into a mindless werewolf themselves. Because once you turn, there's no getting away with it. You can't just like turn into a werewolf, get out of the moonlight, and then you're fine, then you're back into a werewolf. No, you're a werewolf for the entire night, and you're just a mindless monster going around tearing people apart. So I love the idea and the setup of this film. My next positive has to be the practical effects for this movie, whether it's the werewolves themselves, the practical effects that were used to get those werewolves and bring them to life, or the carnage surrounding those werewolves. For instance, there's a scene where somebody gets their face completely scraped off of their skull, and so you see their face get taken away. It's just a really cool practical effect. I'm not saying that CGI wasn't used in this movie, because I'm sure it was, but there's a lot of really cool practical effects that they use around the werewolves and the carnage surrounding the werewolves, and I wanted to point that out. And my final positive for this movie has to be Frank Grillo. I think that he's perfectly cast in this movie because, yeah, I can kind of buy him as a scientist, not so much, but I really bought him as a lethal protector, someone that would go to whatever lengths it took to protect the people he cared about and the people that he loved. And if that meant standing toe-to-toe with a bunch of werewolves or shooting them with a machine gun, whatever he needed to do, I liked that about this movie. I thought Frank Grillo was a perfect casting. He was really fun to watch go up against these monsters. That'll lead me over to the negative side of my review, and the first negative that I have for this movie is that the movie seems to make stuff up as it goes along, which makes the story feel kind of weak. Like, I liked the story setup of this film, I liked the concept of this film, but when you get to the execution, outside of just the monster carnage, when you're looking at the story execution, I feel like they sort of made things up as they went along. And what I mean by that is that at the beginning of this film, you see somebody holding a sign, and that sign says, "Only the evil turn." So maybe at the beginning of this film, you're kind of like, okay, well, maybe not everybody can turn into a werewolf, and maybe that's what that sign is saying, like maybe only evil people turn into werewolves. Like, it's not established at the beginning, but it does give you that hint of doubt that maybe not everybody turns into werewolves. And then you've got people who are signing up to become these werewolf test dummies for these scientists at the beginning, and you're like, okay, they've got scars on them, so they must have previously turned into werewolves, because the transition process in this movie to become a werewolf is pretty violent. And so, okay, these people must have been people that turned into them. But then you find out that anybody touched by this supermoon light can turn into a werewolf. And you're like, all right, well, kind of feels like, yeah, we're just making up as you went along, but I can let that slide. Maybe you just didn't explain it enough. That's fine. But then you get to the werewolves themselves. And these things are basically mindless monsters. Like if you turn into a werewolf, like I said earlier, doesn't matter who's on the side. Could be your mother, your father, you could be your son, your daughter. Doesn't matter. You're going to turn into a mindless werewolf and you're going to attack them and you're going to kill them. And that's the thing about these werewolves that kind of makes this plot that much better, because you could be running with your friend turns into a werewolf, and now you are running from that werewolf. And I think that's a really cool concept. But again, this movie sort of makes things up as it goes along, because these things are mindless, right? Except the main characters in this movie have a next door neighbor who turns into a werewolf and then seems to want to break into their house only and go after them only. And I suppose you can make the argument, well, he just knew there were people there. He was trying to break into that one house, but it's very particular. And most of the werewolves, they have their clothes completely ripped off of them when they turn into werewolves. But this particular werewolf gets to keep some of the colors, face paint that the person had on, and keep the vest, just so you know that it's the neighbor werewolf that you're having to watch. And again, it just felt like, all right, you're kind of bending the rules here, which leads to the last thing that I really feels like bent the rules in this movie, and that is that once again, these werewolves are mindless monsters and they don't have agendas. They just see stuff and they go for it. And in this film, you never see the werewolves attack each other. There's even a scene on the street where there's several werewolves just hanging out looking for humans, and when they see a human, they all turn their heads and they all go for it, right? So they're like mindless dogs, but they're not attacking each other until the end. And I won't spoil things here, but there's a character that, to try and save their family, turns into a werewolf, and then that werewolf takes on other werewolves. And it's like, wait a minute, if you had turned into a werewolf, wouldn't you have just been another mindless monster? So if you had turned into one, even with good intentions, you would have turned around and attacked the humans. But instead, this werewolf now fights other werewolves. And it was like, you really are making stuff up as you go along. Like, you had this concept and you're like, we're just going to shoot, and as we need to make changes, we'll just make changes. It's really no big deal. And I guess in the grand scheme of things, for a monster action flick, depending on what you're looking for, that might be fine. But that goes back to my original point, which was this movie is very weak in the storyline execution, and it just makes stuff up as it goes along. That'll lead me to my other big negative for this film, and that is dumb choices. Listen, people are going to make dumb choices in horror movies. It's just what helps propel the plot in most of them. There's always somebody who shouldn't be playing with a Ouija board, shouldn't be taking some sort of injection, somebody who shouldn't be talking to spirits. You get the idea. People make dumb choices. Or maybe there's a killer in the house and the person is hiding in a very quiet spot, and then they sneeze and it's like, no, not that. That was a dumb choice to make. You should have covered it up. So people make dumb choices in horror movies. It helps further the plot. I get that. But some of the dumb choices in this movie really stretched how dumb people should be in a horror movie. Like, for instance, you've got this fortified house, almost like The Purge, where you've got people completely fortifying their houses, and then they have a PA system on the outside. Now, I'm not really sure why they needed to have a PA system on the outside, because the whole thing was, once the door is shut, do not make any noise, don't attract any werewolves. But of course, as soon as the doors are shut and there's werewolves out there, one of the main characters is like, I think I'll press this PA button. Is anybody out there? Does anybody need help? And you're like, what are you doing? You were supposed to be quiet. So there's choices like that that kind of irritated me. But one of the biggest ones, at the beginning of this film, you have Frank Grillo, who you find out is this scientist, and he's fortifying this house for his sister-in-law and their daughter because his brother was killed by werewolves the year before. So he's fortifying this house for them. And he looks at his sister-in-law and he's like, I don't know if I can go do this. And she's like, no, you have to. It's for the human race. Everyone's counting on you. You gotta go. And you find out that he's a scientist working on this cure, and you're like, all right, that kind of makes sense. So he leaves. But then, as soon as something goes wrong, the sister-in-law screams out, why did you have to go? And it's like, bitch, you told him to go. What are you talking about? You're the one that told him to go. He was about to stay. He was like, screw the human race. I'm going to keep my house safe. And you're like, no, you go. It's what needs to happen. So there's a lot of choices like that throughout this film that really hurt my enjoyment of this film just because characters were being so stupid. Overall, guys, I will say that I had a decent enough time watching Werewolves. This is nowhere near my favorite movie of the year, but as far as werewolf movies are concerned, and if you're there for the werewolf carnage, it's a fun enough time. So would I recommend this to people? Well, if you're a big monster movie fan, or if you like werewolves, maybe check this one out. Maybe wait for it on streaming. I don't think there'll be that big of a difference if you see it on the biggest screen possible, or if you watch it at home in the comfort of your own home with some pajamas on and some popcorn that you just got out of the microwave. I love the home theater experience. But what I'm trying to say to you guys is I don't know how necessary this is to run out to the theaters. Maybe if you're a mega fan. If you're not a fan of monster movies, this isn't really going to be for you at all. So that's an easy one for me to say, just skip it. But those are just my opinions because that's my review for Werewolves. Guys, if you had a chance to see this movie yet, if you have, let me know in the comment section down below. Let me know if you liked it, didn't like it. Maybe we agree or disagree. Maybe there's some things that you really liked about it that I didn't. I'd love to know all of your opinions. So throw them down in the comment section down below and let me know what you think of Werewolves. And finally, guys, if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button because it helps the video, it helps the channel, and it helps me right here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Alright guys, we got to the end of my Werewolves review. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. I had a great time watching this movie, even though it wasn't my favorite of the year. I just knew I was going to have a really fun time doing a review for it, and here we are. And with that said, guys, if you want to check out any of the other content on my channel, well, I've got all of my horror movie reviews right there, and I've got all of my 2024 movie reviews right there.